What if everything believed about right and wrong, good and evil, justice and injustice is fundamentally mistaken? That is the provocation launched by Friedrich Nietzsche, a bold German thinker with a striking presence who shattered the comfortable foundations of conventional morality. He did not merely question values like sympathy, kindness, and altruism. He argued that these concepts, far from being universal, can be damaging to human development when they are absolutized and weaponized against strength, ambition, and the creative drive of life. For Nietzsche, moral comfort can become a velvet cage, and virtue can become a resignation costume worn to hide envy, fear, and a refusal to grow. But here is the uncomfortable twist. Nietzsche's critique of Christian morality was not a mere rejection born out of cynicism. It was a surgical re-examination of ethical foundations. He believed that being good, in the traditional sense, can trap a person in a life of dissatisfaction, denial, and moral theatricality. Under the glow of piety, one might learn to punish one's own vitality, calling strength sin and calling impotence virtue. And when a culture rewards that, it produces citizens who are restless, resentful, and forever divided within themselves. In this narrative journey, we will explore why Nietzsche saw morality as a human invention designed, often unconsciously, to limit power, subdue the human animal, and domesticate excellence. We will also confront why he saw in so-called moral people the shadow of duplicity and the fever of resentment. This is not an invitation to cruelty. It is an invitation to lucidity. And it is a challenge to discover if the life lived is guided by chosen values or inherited rules that no longer fit the body and soul. To grasp how resentment shapes morality, begin with a scene from Amadeus by Peter Schaffer. Salieri, a hard-working, mediocre composer, confronts Mozart's effortless genius. Salieri is devoured by jealousy, wounded by a cosmic injustice he cannot bear, and so he plots to ruin what he cannot match. His vengeance consumes them both. Salieri is eaten alive by the hatred he nurses. Mozart is destroyed by a rival whose hands cannot create, but whose spite can certainly unmake. This is the logic of ressentiment. The powerless cannot strike outward in creative mastery, so they strike inward and sideways, deforming value itself, insisting that what they could not achieve was worthless all along. Nietzsche sees a civilization built on the alchemy of that pain, and risk, defined good in terms of their own qualities: strength, excellence, courage, creativity, and command. This was the noble or master morality. It did not exalt altruism as a universal law. It exalted responsibility, vigor, honor. It affirmed the world first, and then named values that served that affirmation. As classes stratified and power concentrated, the many who were weak inverted the values of the few who were strong. Where the noble exalted strength and clarity, the resentful exalted weakness and compliance. Where the noble loved risk, the resentful loved safety. Where the noble affirmed life, the resentful condemned it with 1,000 subtle moral cautions. Nietzsche called this slave morality. It is a morality born not of yes, but of no, not from the joy of what one can do, but from hatred of what one cannot. It demonizes power, not because power is intrinsically evil, but because power threatens those who cannot wield it. It praises humility, chastity, obedience, and meekness, not because these are necessarily beautiful, but because they cut the legs out from under the proud. If the giant kneels, the small man feels tall. He warns against a morality based on resentment because it quietly reorganizes society to normalize mediocrity, to fear excellence, to suspect the vigorous, and to reward the timid. This inversion does not merely protect the weak, it bleaches the color from human potential. At the center of Nietzsche's thought stands the will to power, the primal impulse to expand, shape, and express form. It is not a mere hunger to dominate others. It is the drive of life to become what it is. The tragedy of slave morality is not simply that it condemns the conqueror, it also condemns the saint who burns with the same intensity. The philanthropist who reshapes a city and the general who reshapes an empire share a common voltage of energy. This is why Nietzsche says it is impossible to create the exceptional without also risking the monstrous. Perhaps the course of Europe would never have been altered. Perhaps the steel in his will would have rusted before it ever left the scabbard. Nietzsche's point is not that Napoleon was simply good. It is that greatness requires a capacity to step beyond the theater of moral approval. Those who require moral permission before every act will never move the world. Now descend a level deeper. What is the moral person? Most have known someone who became unbearable by following a rigid moral code. Someone who judges, sermonizes, and polices everyone else's behavior. Someone who produces nothing but condemns plenty. Nietzsche sees in this figure a mask. Moral outrage as a form of disguised will to power. It is domination in a robe of innocence. It is not justice speaking. It is the will to control the scene, to seize the moral microphone, to command, to shame, to rule. Nietzsche does not condemn the desire to shape the world. He calls that honest. He condemns the dishonesty of calling domination virtue. In the moralist's hands, the whip is soft, but it bites more deeply because it strikes the soul. If this sounds harsh, consider the parable of the fox and the grapes. Unable to reach the grapes, the fox decides they were sour anyway. This is moral life under resentment. The mind that cannot achieve tells a story in which achievement is corrupt, wealth is immoral, leadership is tyrannical, beauty is vanity, and mastery is arrogance. The story anesthetizes the pain of failure by cursing what was desired. And yet the desire does not die. It goes underground and turns to bile. A society built on that bile cannot praise excellence without apology, cannot celebrate courage without suspicion, cannot love heroes without handcuffs. Nietzsche fears a species that explains away its vitality. He fears the fate of Dostoevsky, this underground man, a consciousness so allergic to action that it drowns in self-commentary, a will so fractured that it cannot decide and cannot stop analyzing, a soul that makes promises it never intends to keep, grand heavenly vows and petty earthly revenges, all undelivered. A civilization of underground men cannot build, cannot create, cannot risk. It can only watch, gossip, and resent. At this point, the objection arises. But haven't slave morality cultures also achieved greatness? Cathedrals, universities, sciences, laws, and arts. Nietzsche would reply that the long historical arc is complex. Societies can carry contradictory currents for centuries. The old noble energies do not vanish overnight. They are slowly domesticated, moralized, and turned against themselves. The question is not whether moral systems sometimes coincide with greatness. It is whether the logic of a system ultimately directs a civilization toward affirmation or decay. When moral codes teach people to hate their own power, to apologize for their gifts, and to worship safety as the highest good, the horizon narrows. The springs of vitality clog. The future begins to smell like yesterday. Take a hard look at the modern attention economy. Do the dopamine loops that promise pleasure elevate the soul, or do they hollow it out, making courage feel dangerous and comfort feel sacred? Slave morality is not just about churches. It is also about feeds and metrics and carefully engineered outrage. When resentment becomes a business model, moral posturing becomes a content strategy. The theater of virtue goes viral. One does not need to be a bishop to preach shame anymore. One just needs a platform. So what is to be done? Nietzsche refuses the naive question, what is good? The more dangerous and revealing question is, why do we call this good? Who benefits? What does this value do to the body? Does it increase tension, direction, capability, and joy? Or does it create paralysis, guilt, denial, and obedience? For Nietzsche, values are tools, not commandments. They are forged to shape life. When tools no longer fit the living hand must craft new tools. This is the meaning of philosophizing with a hammer, not smashing everything from bitterness, but tapping idols to hear which are hollow. The hammer is a tuning fork. It listens, it tests, it refuses to worship what no longer gives life. To philosophize with a hammer is to grow up ethically, to stop outsourcing conscience to the crowd, and to begin the adult work of value creation. No previous Western philosopher, Nietzsche insists, emphasized this freedom more. The freedom to choose values, to build them, to test them, to mend them when they break. But here again, caution. To celebrate power without conscience is to descend into brutality. Nietzsche's call is not to worship strength. It is to be honest about strength, to integrate it rather than demonize it, to educate it rather than deny it, to use it rather than rot it. Integrate the shadow is the Jungian phrase that arrives later, but the seed is here. Do not pretend to be harmless, become capable, and then choose restraint. The deed makes the virtue real. Harmlessness is not virtue, it is inability. Virtue is power mastered. When power is repressed, it rarely disappears. It sneaks out the side door as resentment, gossip, self-righteousness, and addiction to moral outrage. It resurfaces as self-contempt and as the endless need to control others' freedom. A strong culture does not need to keep saying good and evil every 5 minutes. It does good because it can. Against whom? Against what? Who triggers envy? Who triggers moral disgust? And what would it take to train that competence in myself? Not to outshine them, but to honor life. This is anti-resentment training. It turns poison into fuel. Notice whether humility increases power or merely camouflages fear. If altruism is praised, practice it, but refuse the performance. The body knows. It reports. Believe the report, not the propaganda. Keep what increases strength and honesty, discard what creates weakness and self-deception. A culture that hates ambition produces safety without meaning and equality without dignity. In such a culture, kindness is not a compensation for weakness, it is the grace of the strong. When that happens in enough people, institutions will change as echo. So yes, what if the deepest beliefs about right and wrong are wrong? The fear that arises is natural. The first shock is recognizing that much of what passes for morality can be a costume for resentment. The second, harder step is construction. If inherited values are hollow in key places, how does one forge new ones without becoming monstrous? This is where the work begins. The aim is not to glorify brute force, nor to dissolve all ethics into appetite. The aim is to practice an honest strength that can hold itself to account. Power is not the enemy. Dishonesty is. Clarity about power, how it moves through the body, how it steers attention, how it bends speech. This is the beginning of a clean ethic that neither fears strength nor worships it. The underground man is the cautionary portrait. A person divided against oneself, forever promising and never delivering, narrating grand plans in the head while refusing the small acts that would give those plans flesh. The superstition at the core of that division is simple, that goodness equals harmlessness. A morality that teaches people to be harmless produces adults who cannot be trusted with responsibility. To heal that division, one must risk the embarrassment of beginning, the humility of practice, and the offense of visible ambition. Nietzsche rarely uses the language of habit formation, yet practice is everywhere implied in his challenge. The body must be trained to desire difficulty. The mind must be trained to digest contradiction. The soul must be trained to tell itself the truth, even when truth cracks the public image, carefully curated for approval. So what would values look like if forged under the hammer and tuned to life rather than to applause? Think of them not as commandments, but as weights on a bar, instruments of strength rather than instruments of shame. Consider this working set, an aristocracy of function rather than birth. Vital honesty, a stubborn refusal to self-deceive, even when lies would make life smoother. This antidote to moral theatrics keeps will to power from mutating into will to delusion. It trades narrative comfort for contact with reality. It asks in every domain what result is produced, not what story can be told. Constructive ambition, the discipline to build something non-trivial over time. Ambition is not greed, it is direction. It is the choice to give a shape to life. Book, business, craft, research, institution, family, a community that outlives one's pulse. It ties pride to production, not performance, to consequences rather than to rhetoric. Courageous restraint, the capacity for harm, deliberately unused. Restraint with no power underneath smells like fear. Restraint built on capability smells like trust. It is the restraint of the surgeon, the pilot in turbulence, the founder in crisis, measured, firm, exact. Hierarchy of competence. Leaders lead because they can. Teachers teach because they know. Healers heal because they have earned trust through repeated results. Titles do not create competence. Competence creates the right to carry a title. One honors equality before the law, without lying about equality of outcomes or pretending equality of ambition. Fit kindness. Kindness that increases the giver's strength and the receiver's capacity. Help that creates dependency is counterfeit compassion. Help that builds capability is love with a spine. Fit kindness leaves both parties more able to meet the future. Aesthetic affirmation, a bias toward beauty, excellence, and craft. Beauty is discipline made visible. It is not a luxury, it is a training signal for desire, teaching the eye, ear, and hand to recognize higher patterns and to want them. A culture starved of beauty descends into cheap stimulation. A culture trained in beauty climbs toward form. None of these are abstract slogans when taken seriously. Each becomes concrete the moment one ties it to a calendar, a craft, a cohort, and a feedback loop. The question is always the same. What are the results? If a value increases strength, clarity, and the capacity to do good work, it stays. If it produces paralysis, guilt, resentment, or the need to control others, it goes. The hammer is a testing tool, not a wrecking ball. It listens for resonance. It does not smash from bitterness. It taps to discover structure. This approach allows a reconciliation with virtues often branded as soft without surrendering them to resentment. Mercy without power simply permits repetition of harm. Forgiveness without responsibility is permission disguised as piety. Charity that weakens is an insult wearing perfume. But mercy braided with justice is strength learning to heal. Forgiveness braided with accountability is strength learning to restore. Charity braided with competence is strength learning to raise. The saint without strength is safe for no one. The saint who can wield power and chooses gentleness is not a lamb. This is a lion who has learned to purr. Return to the will to power. If it is the core movement of life, the impulse to expand, shape, and give form, then the ethical task is not suppression, but education. Education does not mean moral branding. It means targets, practice, feedback, and revision. It requires stepping out of the theater of identity, where goodness is performed as correct opinion, and stepping into a workshop where goodness is evidenced by built reality. Moral identity without output is brand management. Goodness is not a hashtag. It is a competence that benefits life. If acclaimed goodness cannot build a bridge, heal a wound, comfort a child, organize a team, stabilize a home, navigate a crisis or face a loss, then it is not goodness, it is a costume. Creators therefore stand at the center of Nietzsche's positive horizon. Creation binds power to reality. The artist is judged by the canvas, the builder by the building, the leader by consequences. Creation purifies because it exposes one to refusal. The resentful prefer fantasy victories, debates won in the head against imaginary enemies. The creator must risk public failure. That risk cleans the palette of envy. It replaces moral vanity with contact. It turns energy toward shaping the world rather than cursing it. This shift reframes envy itself. Salieri's complaint against Mozart, that genius is unfair, is true at the surface and false at the depth. Life is asymmetrical. The noble response to asymmetry is not to demand cosmic redistribution of talent. It is to transform envy into apprenticeship. Apprenticeship asks the question that envy refuses. What here can be learned? Not everything. Genius has a remainder, but enough to build a life. The apprentice sweeps floors, copies structures, analyzes failures, tracks patterns, repeats steps, and grows. In the apprenticeship economy, resentment withers, not because pain vanishes, but because there is no time to hate when one is deeply occupied with becoming strong. Imagine a civilization redesigned around apprenticeship. Replace mass moral schooling, where people learn to speak the right phrases about the right causes, with guilds of excellence, where people learn to do difficult, beautiful, useful things. Reward the long arc of mastery, not the short spike of outrage. Celebrate those who fail in public and return to the task. A culture that trains makers will find less energy available for moral surveillance because competence demands the full attention of the nervous system. Busy hands wag fewer fingers. What about justice? Does this world not become cruel without the softening force of moral equality? The mature answer refuses a childish binary. Equality before the law is non-negotiable. Equality of outcome is a sedative. Equality of ambition is a lie. Justice is not sameness. Justice is proportion. The right person in the right role with the right responsibility, accountable to the feedback of reality. In such a world, the weak are protected not by making the strong ashamed, but by cultivating the strong to be reliable. Reliability is the social face of mastery, strength that others can trust. Translate this into daily practice to make it real. Daily, deliberate discomfort. Choose one act that trains the body to stop equating discomfort with wrongness. Cold exposure, early writing, skill drills, a difficult conversation, deep work without digital sedation. The point is not machismo. The point is teaching the nervous system that difficulty is a green light for growth, not a red light of danger. Weekly, tangible artifact. Produce one object others can encounter. Prototype, essay, design iteration, lesson plan, revenue experiment, dataset, performance. Tie self-respect to creation, not to opinion. Let the artifact invite feedback. Feedback is reality speaking. Monthly resentment audit, list names, patterns, and triggers. For each, identify the competence gap it reveals. Replace why them with what must be learned. Set one training target that dissolves the resentment by growth instead of revenge. Quarterly value experiment. Select one cherished value and test whether it increases power as lived. Practice it intentionally for 30 days with measurable outputs. Keep what builds capacity and honesty. Discard what weakens, even if it flatters the ego or wins applause. Yearly rite of passage. Stage a challenge that compresses a decade of learning into a season of effort. An expedition, a startup sprint, a book, a certification, a tournament, a performance. Ritualize the crossing from one level of competence to the next. Let family and friends witness. Mark the change in the body. None of this requires abandoning kindness or spirituality. It only requires anchoring virtue in capability. A capable person's kindness does not tremble. It does not need to be seen. It does not need the excuse of weakness. It glows because it can afford to. It can set boundaries because it can enforce them. It can forgive because it can punish. It can be gentle because it can be firm. It can love because it does not hate its own power. And what of evil? Resist turning evil into a metaphysical storm cloud. Most evil is ordinary weakness with opportunity, ordinary envy with a crowd, ordinary fear with a weapon. The antidote is not naivete. The antidote is a population trained in strength, truthfulness, and responsibility, with institutions that demand proof in action rather than PR in slogans. Such people are harder to recruit into mobs because they are busy building. They are harder to seduce with resentment because they have tasted the sweeter intoxication of creation. They do not need enemies to feel alive. If this sounds austere, notice the joy hiding inside it. When values are forged by practice rather than inherited by decree, they fit like tailored clothes. The body stops fighting the ethic because the ethic was built with the body in mind. Work begins to feel like worship, not punishment. Discipline becomes a form of love. Love for the future self, love for the craft, love for the people who will depend on one's reliability in the hour that matters. At the end of this road stands amor fati, love of one's fate. Amor fati is not passive. It does not say, whatever happens is good. It says, everything that happens I will use. It is not romantic about suffering, it is pragmatic. Suffering becomes information and fuel. Loss becomes instruction in what must be reinforced. Failure becomes a blueprint. Success becomes responsibility. One stops negotiating with life for guarantees and begins to negotiate with oneself for standards. Gratitude grows teeth. Philosophizing with a hammer, then, is not demolition for its own sake. It is renovation. Each tap asks, does this belief bear weight? Does this ritual increase or decrease capacity? Does this habit make me honest or make me false? Where the sound rings hollow, carve out the rot and frame anew. Where the sound rings solid, strengthen the joint. Build a livable interior, rooms of competence, corridors of courage, windows of aesthetic joy, a hearth of kindness that warms because there is wood to burn. This mission will not be popular with everyone, and that is acceptable. Mass adoption is not the point, depth is. Integrity is the point. A society cannot be better in the aggregate than the honesty of its individuals multiplied. If a critical mass of people shift from performing goodness to building it, institutions will eventually echo that shift. Until then, expect the theater of moral outrage to keep selling tickets. Resentment is profitable. Outrage is easy content. Excellence is slower. But excellence, once it compounds, changes the weather. To close, bring this down to a single week. Choose one inherited value that rings hollow under the hammer and suspend it gently. Not forever, just long enough to watch what happens without it. In its place, install one forged value and make it visible through a single act. If harmlessness is the inherited value, suspend it and practice courageous restraint instead. Learn to say no with a steady voice. If niceness is the inherited value, suspend it and practice fit kindness. Offer help that trains, not help that traps. If humility as self-erasure is the inherited value, suspend it and practice silent competence. Ship the work without the apology. Watch how the body responds. Watch how people respond. Adjust. Continue. This is the inner odyssey. To stop resenting power and start educating it. To stop fearing excellence and start earning it. To step beyond the theater where goodness is a costume and into a workshop where goodness is a craft. If this resonated, bring one reflection to the circle. Name a value inherited that under the hammer rings hollow, and a value forged that rings true. Then choose a single act this week that will make the true value visible. The Odyssey does not end here. It begins every time a human being risks creation over complaint, responsibility over resentment, and truth over comfort.